Pnawn, good afternoon and welcome everybody. For those that don't know me, I'm Mark Brace, Head of Wales Safer Communities Network, and welcome to today's session, which is part of the network's Safer Communities Awareness Week. The programme for this week also includes a session tomorrow with G4S on working together for better outcomes, and a hackathon event on Thursday in Cardiff on synthetic opioids. Please let us know if you're interested in attending any of these, and we'll let you know the details. We've also just launched the network's second annual awards event, which will take place at Wrexham Football Club on the 28th of November, and we'll go through some more details later on. But as part of the launch, but part of the taster of some of the applications, we're delighted to welcome Richard Sidney from North Wales Police Central Area Priority Crime Team, who will take us through the work on Operation Blue Tylluan, which was not only the winner of the modern slavery category, but also the winner overall at last year's awards. Before handing over to Richard, just to remind you that the session will be recorded, so feel free to turn off your camera if you do not wish to appear. As ever, can you make sure that you're on mute unless speaking, and raise your hand if you want to come in. There will be a chance for questions at the end, and please make the most of the chat box as we go through. We'll pick up any comments and questions, which we'll raise at the question and answer session at the end. So once again, thank you very much for your attendance. And on that note, over to you then, Richard.
Good afternoon, folks. It's a real pleasure to speak to you this afternoon. Let me just share my screen with you so you can see my presentation. And I really hope the sound is going to work because it's quite impactful. So this afternoon is the intention to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of Operation Blue Tylluan, which is an exploitation investigation in the area of county lines. So hopefully I can talk through how we gained some success there in relation to safeguarding children across Wales and the rest of England as well. So can you just let me know whether you can see that?
Yeah, all good.
Fantastic. Okay then. So as I say, my name's Richard Sidney. I'm actually now the Detective Inspector on the Serious Organised Crime Unit at North Wales Police. But when I led this investigation, it was just within one of the CID officers within one of the divisions of North Wales in a sort of small priority crime team. And if I just start with what the initial scenario was. So back in February 2021, we had an undercover operation ongoing in the Rill area of Denbighshire. And what we had was an undercover officer called Kerry who was putting phone calls into county lines deal numbers with the intention of purchasing heroin and cocaine to try and identify who was actually selling the drugs in the area. So on one occasion, a call was put into the line and somebody who looked really young turned up. And it later transpired that he was a vulnerable 14-year-old missing person who was in care and who had absconded from outside of North Wales, who was extremely vulnerable. So once he was identified, a further call was put into the line and he attended again to supply the drugs, and he was detained by ourselves at that point. And when he was spoken to by our uniformed officers, he himself identified that he was in possession of a large quantity of heroin and cocaine. I think he had about £500 worth of cash on him, and he had a typical sort of burner type mobile phone, a non-smartphone basically, as well as an iPhone. So the uniformed officers arrested him at that point, and he was subject to an interview like people usually are. He provided a no comment interview, and he was also given a welfare interview subsequently following that, in the hope that he might be willing to disclose stuff that he wasn't willing to disclose during a sort of a formal interview. Unfortunately, he wasn't, and he certainly didn't see himself as a victim of any sort of exploitation. So he was referred to the National Referral Mechanism as a potential victim of exploitation and modern slavery. We shared the information with our partners from the other force area, and he was returned to that local authority where he could be safeguarded. So obviously we wanted to get to the bottom of what had happened to him. So we downloaded his mobile phone initially, And upon downloading his mobile phone, it was really apparent that somebody somewhere was exploiting him. And I'll just go through some of those messages so you can see what that looked like. So these are the initial messages that we found. So the ones in blue are our vulnerable 14-year-old, where he says himself, he volunteers himself, I need work as soon as possible. Have you got work for me? So that's suggesting that he wants to be involved in the criminal activity of this drug dealer. And the reply is, I'll have a brand new phone powered up for you, basically. So somebody is willing to engage him in what is happening. And then there were other messages such as, why you're not answering your phone? People have been coming to this address for drugs. So indicating that he is involved in that drug dealing and suggesting that he's got to answer to what he's doing. As well as this, where somebody messages him and says, let me know how much you've got there. And he replies, £410. So clearly he is collecting drugs on behalf of somebody else likely to be an adult. So in addition to the text messages that we recovered, we also recovered a series of videos. Now, these are quite graphic and they tell you exactly what it looks like to be a 14-year-old involved in county lines type drug dealing and county lines type exploitation. So you're going to see weapons and it really highlights the risks involved to those children who find themselves in these scenarios. So we can see that he obviously thinks he's at significant risk, hence the reason for using the weapons. But it also really highlights why these adults put these children on the front line to distance themselves from taking that risk themselves. And it just paints a really vivid picture. So if I start with this video.
Spent nights in the teeth with the shoes on my feet. In love with the cash, fell in love with the streets. Bros telling me I bring fire to the beat. Fire to the beat, like I'm the hottest in the hood. I'm trying to grow like a tree. I'm not talking about wood. Me bros know the bros. I'm not talking about blood. Got me.
So we didn't know where that address was. It could have been anywhere. That's our victim. You can see holding the weapons, and that was obviously like a serrated type machete type knife, as well as a metal kosh. So we have another video here. Again, another trap house, they call it, where people deal controlled drugs. That's heroin and cocaine. He's got there, significant amount for a 14-year-old. I'm sure you agree. Another knife and a typical sort of burner type mobile phone that is used for these drug lines. And if you were to sort of write up a drama about county lines drug dealing, this is exactly what you'd expect to see in that drama, except this is real life, not on the television. This is a real 14-year-old from our communities. And this video highlights what it's all about. So this is our child holding a quantity of cash, sort of making out it's his, but the reality is that we've seen from the text messages, it's not his. He's got to give it back to some adult. So there's no real kudos there, although that's what he's trying to make out. And again, as well as distancing themselves from the violence, this is why the adults are doing it. And it's to make that money. But they use children to distance themselves from the violence, as well as distancing themselves from the criminality. So the kids are taking all of that risk. So at that time, we had this phone download, we had the seized drugs, we had the cash that demonstrated that this child had been exploited by somebody. But we certainly didn't have any complaint from the child. And in fact, he was telling us that he hadn't been exploited. And when you think about the sort of crimes that police usually investigate, or where they make progress with investigations, this is where somebody is telling the police that they have been assaulted or they have had something stolen from them. Where the difficulty with this sort of criminality is that for a number of really good reasons, people are reluctant to tell the authorities around what has happened to them. So whether that's the sort of the fear of violence, maybe embarrassment, the fear of repercussions, maybe at this time, all of a sudden they might feel that they've got some sort of kudos within their community or a bit of respect where previously haven't, and they don't want to lose that. Really good reasons why people don't want to tell us about it, but clearly we could see that something was amiss and he was a victim of exploitation. So we launched Operation Tylluan to try and identify what had happened to that child in the 2-week period where he had been reported missing until we found him, and to try and bring those who were responsible for his exploitation to justice. So obviously the start point was the phone download that we had for him, so we could obviously manage to work out what number he was using. So we got the call data in relation to that, who he had been in contact with and who had been contacting him, where he had travelled to. So for instance, we could see that he'd been in contact with a number of different taxi companies. So we approached the taxi companies to see where he had been picked up from, where he had been dropped off, what names were used, how was payment done, as much as information as we could from those journeys. And also we put the telephone numbers that we got from the call data through our police databases to try and identify who the individuals were that we might know use those numbers. We looked at the social media profiles around those individuals to try and build up a picture, what vehicles they had, and what travel patterns we could see. And significantly, we worked in partnership with a lot of different partners, such as probation, the local authorities, and significantly in this case, the prison service. So what we identified from the telephone numbers was that that initial person that he'd contacted where he said, I need the work, in the first text messages that I showed you, that number was used by somebody by the name of Wesley Hankin, who was in prison in HMP Portland in Dorset, right on the south coast of England. So that individual was hundreds of miles away from our victim. Yet still, the tentacles of exploitation were long enough to sort of entrap him. And from there, we started to build up a picture of what had happened. So one of the most important things we did, and I mentioned about partnership working earlier on, was we got early investigative advice from CPS. And because of the nature of the investigation, in that I mentioned that this is evidence-led, there is no complaint, but we're still investigating it. Obviously, that makes it complex. The geographical boundaries that we had to cross make it complex, as well as a number of different issues. So we went to the complex case unit at CPS, which is based at Cardiff. And effectively what we did was we built up a framework together around the evidence that we'd had to gather to get a successful prosecution and charge somebody. So to be able to prove that somebody has committed the offence of human trafficking, you have to demonstrate that they have been involved in the recruitment, receipt, transport, transfer, or harbouring for an individual, ultimately for the purpose of exploitation. Now, if they know or ought to know that the victim is a child, then you don't need to prove the middle bit, because they're a child and that's it. You cannot do those things under the Act for the purpose of exploitation. If you know it's a child, that's it. But if you don't know that they're a child and you think that they're an adult, then you have to prove some sort of force, deception or coercion or abduction, fraud, something like that, to make them do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do. Okay, so because our child was 14 and he looked really young, CPS were happy that anybody who met him would know he was a child. So it meant that we didn't have to prove the means but in the middle. So that was great, but it did provide us with a difficulty that I'll come on to later on. So really importantly, we built a framework with our colleagues from CPS. So what did the evidence tell us then? Well, bearing in mind, and I'll keep repeating this is just a 2-week period. We identified that our child had a footprint in 4 of the 6 Northwest forces in the 2-week period that he was missing. So that was, he was in North Wales, Cheshire, GMP and Merseyside. And in addition to that, he also travelled down to the south of England and back. So significant amounts of movement. We could see that multiple adults were involved in that exploitation right from the beginning when he was recruited. all the way down to other individuals who had some vulnerabilities themselves, but ultimately harboured him within their homes so they could curry favour from the organised crime group and get easier access or cheaper access to drugs themselves. So initially, Wesley Hankin, that initial offender who I mentioned earlier, made contact with our victim, and he arranged for him to meet another male by the name of Gareth Mark Jones in the Merseyside Force area. And Gareth Mark Jones supplied him with the graph phone, or the burner phone that we saw within the videos that I showed you. The child then travelled to Greater Manchester, into Wigan, and commenced dealing from a number of different addresses. The videos that I showed you earlier on with the knives, and you can only imagine the sort of risk that this 14-year-old was at then. After about a week, he returned to Merseyside before being transported to North Wales. So upon returning to Merseyside, the Wigan-based organised crime group exchanged our child's contact details with the North Wales-based organised crime group. Somebody travelled from Rhyl, picked him up from Merseyside, brought him back to Rhyl, and during the course of that journey, they're sending messages out saying, basically, we can supply you with heroin and cocaine. And in North Wales, he remained in a number of different addresses there. So for a 2-week period, a significant amount of stuff happened, and the child was at a significant amount of risk. So it took around 8 months, I suppose, to pull this together. Bearing in mind, at this time, we're in the midst of COVID. So obviously that had challenges in itself. But ultimately, we arrested 16 suspects on suspicion of human trafficking. So quite often you will hear about police taking action in relation to county lines. And often we talk about how county lines actually involve vulnerable people and their vulnerability in cuckooing. But the reality is, when you think about when police take action, how often do they actually focus on the exploitation rather than just the drug dealing that they're used to dealing with? So this was a genuine attempt to focus on the exploitation of this individual. We executed 12 search warrants across North Wales, JMP, Cheshire and Merseyside, produced people from prison from HMP Byddwn and HMP Portland. And ultimately, we managed to charge 9 individuals with human trafficking. So we charged 7 individuals with supply of Class A drugs. Some of those were some of the individuals involved in the trafficking. Some weren't, but just getting charges in relation to this offending was a real bonus, because the reality is that the number of people charged with these type of offences is really low because of the complexities around people not willing to disclose what has actually happened to them. So I'm just going to play you a video now of Gareth Mark Jones being arrested. Now, this is the individual who met our child in Merseyside and handed him the graph phone. So you'll see when I play the video, this house could be on any estate anywhere in the country. It could be your next door neighbour. And listen to his response when he's arrested for the modern slavery and exploitation, and compare it to his response when he's arrested in relation to the drug dealing. Hopefully the sound plays all right.
Okay, police! Gareth, where are you, police? Okay, come to us with your hands up, mate.
Where you are, mate.
Hands.
Put the blanket over you, mate.
Okay.
Right. Gareth.
Right.
I'm BC 3018 Simon Moodley. Okay. I'm from North Wales Police. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to arrest you on suspicion of modern day slavery offences.
Modern day slavery?
Yeah. Child trafficking. Okay. Conspiracy to supply Class A heroin and cocaine. Yeah. And also money laundering. Okay. So you don't have to say anything, but in my harm defence, if you don't mention when questioned, something which later on in court, anything you do say may be given evidence. Do you understand?
Okay.
What I need to do now is I need to interview you at the custody suite, okay?
So clearly you can see when he's arrested in relation to the drug dealing offences, he doesn't bat an eyelid. Yeah, I get it, I know it's coming, but he's got no concept whatsoever that he has been abusing children by what he's been doing and committing human trafficking offences. which I think is really significant, and it demonstrates the mentality of these people who are doing this. So all that sounds fantastic, but we had a problem. So, as I said earlier, the main suspect, Wesley Hankin, is in prison. We've got the text messages to demonstrate that he's involved in the sort of movement of our child. The attribution is really strong because, believe it or not, we actually managed to seize the phone that was used from his prison cell, and we could show that the calls either side of that to the victim were to his girlfriend. So unless he was going to suggest that somebody else in the prison was contacting his girlfriend, it's definitely him. So the attribution was really strong, but we couldn't prove the suspect, Wesley Hankin, had ever met our victim. So we couldn't prove that he knew he was a child. And because the messages that the child had sent initially to Wesley Hankin suggested that he was willing to be involved, it meant that we couldn't prove that there'd been some sort of deception as if he'd known he was an adult. So we just couldn't prove around those technicalities enough to charge him with human trafficking, which is obviously what we wanted to do. So we did the next best thing, which was to get a slavery and trafficking risk order, which is a civil order that puts conditions on individuals where you can demonstrate to the court that there's a real risk of that person committing exploitation offences, where you just haven't got enough evidence. So we worked with the National County Lines Coordination Centre, who provided us with advice. And it's the force where that individual resides, other than when they're in prison, where they would ordinarily reside, that has to apply for it. So we work with Merseyside and our colleagues at the ROCU, and the interim STRO was granted, preventing him having contact with any children other than his own biological children. So that meant that we'd gone some way to safeguarding children right the way across the UK in relation to his offending. And it's actually in place for 15 years, which at the time was the second longest STRO in the country. So although we couldn't secure those human trafficking charges in relation to him, I'm satisfied that we've done our absolute best to safeguard other children from him. But in addition to that, he was charged with the drugs offences. So this is a bit of a diagram as to what the network looked like. So we had the offenders in Wigan, and the main man is Wesley Hankin at the top. That's how our child had him saved. Wayne was Gareth Mark Jones, and they called the drugs line the Wayne line. And from the videos and other bits of evidence, we identified 3 different addresses that our child had been at. We've got him named as Jacob on there. That's not his real name, but we could see that he'd been to 3 different addresses. And then over in Rhyl, we could see that he'd been involved in 2 different county lines. The model was slightly different, whereas in Wigan, our child was sort of receiving the calls and then taking the drugs to the individual himself. In Rhyl, it was slightly different, whereas the people involved in the TJ and Jacko county lines, they would take the calls, then direct our child, which is obviously how he was directed to the undercover officer. We identified the driver who'd been to pick him up and 2 addresses from which he'd been dealing. So out of all of those, one of the addresses in Wigan and one in Rhyl, we couldn't demonstrate that the occupiers of those addresses knew he'd been there and had been drug dealing from those addresses. But out of everybody else, we managed to either secure guilty pleas or convictions in relation to modern slavery, and other than the main man, who was obviously only charged with the drugs offences. So for us, some of the most significant learning came about at sentencing. So this is Wesley Hankin, the chap who was in prison in Dorset. And what I've got to reiterate here is that this drugs conspiracy only lasted for 2 weeks, and it was to the small value of about £1,000. Now, I work in the serious organised crime unit. We have drugs conspiracies that are like 4 years long, and they're to sort of multi-kilo sort of values of over £1 million. This is much smaller. But Wesley Hankin was sentenced to 10 years and 2 months imprisonment, and that is because of the aggravating feature of the exploitation of this child. So you can see how important it is that exploitation is tackled by the police, and they don't just concentrate on the drugs, and how seriously that the court take it. And in fact, the judge said that anybody who runs an organised crime group from in prison runs the risk that, because they're not there in person to control what is going on, there's a risk that people are going to be exploited. And in this case, that is actually what happened, and that Wesley Hankin was culpable in relation to that, which led to the 10-year sentence. And that is after a guilty plea. And if he hadn't done that, his sentence would have been significantly lower, especially if there hadn't been the exploitation element. So some real big learning for us. Gareth Mark Jones pleaded guilty to human trafficking and conspiracy to supply heroin and cocaine. Again, just a 2-week drugs conspiracy with the exploitation element. He pleaded guilty, so got a third off. So he would have been looking at 10 years. And like these others that I'm going to go through, our barrister basically said if we didn't have the exploitation, they would have got about 2 years in prison. So massively significant. They also got slavery and trafficking prevention orders, which, like the risk order, mean that when they're released from prison, they will have conditions around them that mean they can't have contact with children, safeguarding children across the UK from their offending. And it means that the police can police those conditions and look to take immediate action should there be a breach. These are two of the ones from Rill. Michael Hill, the main one, similar story to the last, significant sentence for a 2-week drugs conspiracy, again with the slavery and trafficking prevention order, so protecting other vulnerable people from the offending. And then some further learning that we got back from the media. So I think conviction was around October for the last ones. Sentencing wasn't until January. And I worked with the BBC to get coverage around what we'd learned from the investigation. And I released the footage that I played you earlier on and the text messages to them. And if I'm honest, I had sleepless nights about how they were going to use it and portray what had happened, because ultimately we'd taken the decision not to prosecute our child because we just saw him as a victim. But they used it really sensitively. It was the second top news story on the 6 o'clock news on BBC and got about 6 minutes of coverage, which was really significant given it's covering the whole world's events. And it was the main story on all BBC radio news channels. So got really good, fantastic coverage. But the main learning was around when we did the press release on our Facebook page. So quite often we will get feedback when we post things on social media about, why aren't you looking at paedophiles? Why aren't you looking at that? Why aren't you doing this? But it was really positive. And when I anecdotally compared it to other drugs operations that didn't have an exploitation element, the number of interactions was much more significant. So I think at a previous investigation, we'd had 50. And on this one, we had something like 150. But not only that, it was really positive, and people were talking about safeguarding, protecting vulnerable people, all the stuff that you want people to talk about. And for me, this demonstrated that this type of thing is exactly what our communities expect us to do and what we should be focusing on. So I've given you a real quick whistle-stop tour of a complex investigation there, and I know we're going to have time for questions later on, and I'm more than happy to answer any that you've got.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. And it's great to be reminded. Obviously we were at the awards last year, but it's great to be reminded of this really positive and significant piece of work, isn't it? And I think also just the emphasis on the partnership working and the complexity of it, and the coordination of multiple partners and locations as well. So thank you for the overview there. Before I open up for questions, we're just going to have a couple of minutes just on the next awards. As I mentioned at the start, our next awards ceremony in Wrexham, and Helen's going to put some info up on the screen just so everybody's aware of the awards in November. On to the next slide, which I think is the one with the information on it. So if anybody has got any bits of work or activity they'd like to put forward for the awards, it is, as I said, in Wrexham on the 28th of November. The information's on our website. We've got 14 categories covering a variety of community safety topics. It's the forms on there, and it's one nomination that can be entered for multiple categories. And if you could return those forms to us by 5 p.m. on Friday, the 11th of October. I think I've calculated is about 3.5 weeks, so plenty of time. Judging panel is ourselves, WRGA, Welsh Government, and Policing in Wales. The entries will be judged on prevention, innovation or improvement and impact, and we'll let the winners know by email on the 1st of November. And it's an afternoon event, is hosted by John Paul Davis, who is a TV celebrity who used to be within policing. I don't know if he was he Helen, a police officer or yeah, an ex-police officer who's moved over to television. So we're looking forward to meeting him, and 2 tickets will be allocated for each winner. So thank you very much. More, as I said, all the information for entering is on the website, and there's details in the chat bar. But just to open it up then for any questions or comments on what you've heard this afternoon. Anybody wish to feedback or question Richard on any of the activity or bits and pieces of the investigation? No, I've got one for you, Richard. It's about the partnership. It was so complex in terms of the amount of people involved and the different forces. And also the complexity of the investigation and the subject matter as well. Was it difficult to get partner buy-in, or did you come across any obstacles or any concerns or sort of pushback in terms of just because of the nature of the investigation and what it was about?
Do you know, I think because of the nature of the investigation, it made people really supportive, if I'm honest. Oh. Obviously, I had to sort of build people's trust and make sure people knew what they could expect from me and what I was looking for, and work hard to maintain those relationships and actually get to know different individuals. I felt that once people were on board with what they were doing, they were really supportive. So, for instance, on the arrest days, we worked with the court service, for instance, to make sure there's a dedicated court. We worked with G4S to make sure that people were collected from all different parts of the UK and transported to the remand courts. I felt that the local authorities worked with us really well, and the likes of probation. So I think that once we built up those relationships, people were really supportive. And I think although we've got slightly different agendas, ultimately we're trying to do good work together. And yeah, I think it would have been impossible without the help of our partners. But they were really supportive, and I think that was a really positive aspect of the investigation.
And also we hear about the processes, for example, getting the data off phones and things and sending that away. And did that delay you at all, or was it?
Yeah, so that is a perennial problem with policing, isn't it? Because these smartphones are just getting more and more complex and hold more and more data, and it's a real difficulty for us. So I think previously what you'll have found in police investigations is they would have just seized every single mobile phone and sort of sent them off. But what we try to do is be really specific around which ones we analysed. So from the call data, we were able to identify which phones were the ones that we used in the conspiracy. So we just focused on those ones, and it just meant that we can reduce that time scale and use our resources a little bit better, to be honest. And that's the way that we try to move forward and progress things a bit quicker. But you're absolutely right, that is a real big problem for us.
And just finally, my last one was the victim. What's happened to the victim? Have they been supported? And
yeah, so I think due to the nature of this sort of criminality, unfortunately he's still sort of involved in those circles and at risk in other areas. But what I will say is that I think by prosecuting these offenders and getting the orders that we've done, I think we've prevented offending against other vulnerable people within the communities of not just North Wales, but the rest of the country. So whilst it would be good if I could give you some positive news about him, I think the real benefit to the communities around those others who would have been offended against.
No, and it's a great example of working together and the outcomes that you wanted, wasn't it, in terms of of supporting and creating safer communities as well. So thank you
Yeah.
for that. I can't see any hands up, but what I will say is I think this is going to be available on the website, isn't it, Helen, in case anybody wants to come back to it. But also, please, if you think it'd be of interest to anybody else, please let them know. It's on our website under training, under the training page. So please make yourself available of that, or it's available to anybody who wishes to sign on and see it. But once again, Richard, thank you very much for your time. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance. Please keep an eye out for the other events during the week. And also, as I said, if you do have any nominations or anything that you'd like to submit for the awards, please do. And there's 3.5 weeks to do it, and we look forward to receiving those. So thank you very much. Have a great day, and hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.